It's very nice to be here. I wish it was in person. I was just reminiscing. I did a very short technician job at Birmingham University between my degree and PhD, and I actually worked in the Botanic Gardens there, the Winterbourne. So I would have loved to have had an opportunity to look around there again, but maybe one day. My current role is I'm a professor of molecular plant pathology and research director at Harper Adams University. And I'm just going to tell you a bit about what I do there, and then I'll tell you about how I got here and what I think helped me get here or hindered me to get here in one way or the other. So basically at Harper, I manage the research office. So that's where we support staff in all aspects of applying for funding, looking for funding, helping with costing. I don't do this, I just support the staff with getting it all done, getting things submitted, try and bringing staff together to form consortium, try and getting staff with outside people to form consortium so we can put in for research bids. I'm the committee chair for a number of committees, including the Research Degrees Awarding Board and the Research and Knowledge Exchange Committee. I'm responsible for supporting staff in general in research. So I organise seminars, conferences, workshops, and also just general chatting to staff to support research. Harper Adams is mainly a teaching intensive university, so we're doing a lot of work to improve our research. I was deputy lead for REF last time, and probably lead REF next time, but I'm trying not to think too much about REF at the moment. And on top of all of that, I try and continue to do my own research, which is in plant pathology, bacteria that infect peas and beans. And I do a little bit of teaching. I teach on the plant pathology MSc course here. I used to do a lot of teaching in my previous job, so that's probably the biggest change. This is only the second year I've never marked exam papers, so that's quite a shock. And I'm sure there's many more things that I do as part of my job that aren't on that list, but it's very, very varied. And I think the really good thing about the job is it's very, very varied, but sometimes that's also the bad thing about the job. You're not quite sure which ball to try and keep in the air at the time. So how did I get here? Next slide. So this is my career path. I got a BSc in Biological Sciences at Wolverhampton Polytechnic and did a final year project, plant tissue culture, because I liked the plant modules better than I liked the other modules. It was simple as that, and just found them interesting. And then I was going to do a PhD straight after that, but I didn't get the one I wanted to do. So I went down to Boltonsborough, which is near Glastonbury, and worked as an assistant research scientist in Twyford Plant Laboratories, which was a tissue culture company doing plant science. And that was great. I think it gave me a real sense of work after coming out of being an undergraduate. My degree course didn't have a placement year, so I hadn't actually had that experience. Got made redundant from that, and then I did that brief stint as a research technician at the University of Birmingham, working on a potato breeding project. So all the time it was about plants. And then I got the opportunity and applied for a PhD at Bath University, and I did a case PhD with the watercress industry. So this was my first real time into plant pathology. I looked at crook root disease of watercress. Had a wonderful time paddling around in watercress beds down in Hampshire and really enjoyed doing that. Stayed on briefly at Bath to do a postdoc looking at club root disease of brassicas, so closely related pathogen. And then I got a post at the University of West of England, and I actually I went to UWE for 3 years as a postdoc and stayed 26. Which was never my intention, but that's how it worked out. I started as a research fellow, and this is where I started working on the molecular biology of plant pathogenic bacterium. I got extensions to my postdoc contract, tried for a lectureship in 1 or 2 times, and finally got a lectureship at UWE in molecular biology. And I think of all the jumps in my career, that is the most significant one. Breaking from a postdoc to a lecturer is probably the toughest step. Worked my way up through uni, became a reader, eventually became a professor. And then just as lockdown happened in 2020, I decided it was a good time to apply for a new job. And that's when the opportunity to be research director at Harper came up, which I took. It's really great here. I manage everything from plant pathology to tractor tire pressures, so very, very varied. Didn't really come here for the first year, which was an interesting introduction to a new role, but I'm sure there's a lot of people who've been through that. So that's my career path. What I think has helped me along that path is really my external presence. And I think this is the advice I'd probably give to anyone starting out. Get involved with things outside of your job if you at all possible. So these are just a small selection of the things I've done externally. So I was elected to the board of the British Society of Plant Pathology 2003 to 2006, just after I became a lecturer. And I met loads of people through that. I got my name known. I became invited onto other things, like I was invited to be a member of the editorial board of molecular plant pathology and then a senior editor. On the back of some of that, I was invited to be a co-organiser of a Pseudomonas syringae pathovirus conference in Oxford and met many international people through that. I became an editor for plant pathology and a committee member for UK Plant Science. And all of these things have allowed me to make connections, to learn from other people, to share my research. And because of some of these, I've put in grant applications with other people that have been successful. I've written papers with other people, been successful. I even done some international work, program committee member for American Society of Microbiology, which was really exciting. And then a core member of BBSRC committee. And then I was made president of BSPP, which I did in 2019. And for my sins, for some reason, I've now agreed to be treasurer. So I think what I'm just trying to really say strongly is it's these external connections that you make that allow you to move through your career. I think the challenge is, I think the biggest challenge for me was that jump, as I've said, from postdoc to lecturer. And if you can get known outside, if you can get, publications with other people, grants with other people, and just known in the community, I think that really helps.
So now we move on, thank you, Dawn, to Chris Hartfield. Chris is National Farmers Union, and I think you're a member of the Plant Health Unit, and you have an interest in bees, I believe, Chris. So over to you, Chris.
Hi, everybody. Hopefully you can hear me fine.
Yep, can hear you fine.
So I've been working within the horticulture and farming industry for nearly 30 years, and much of that has really had a plant health focus. And when I'm talking about plant health, I'm not just talking about the kind of the proactive, preventative stuff. There's biosecurity actions we might take to keep plants free from harmful pests and diseases, but also all the kind of reactive stuff as well. We can take the steps we can take to control harmful pests, weeds and diseases once they've arrived, like some of the stuff that Dick was talking about earlier. And of course, those controls include a whole range of things, a whole range of tools and technologies. And I always say that in the context of agriculture and horticultural crops, farmers and growers aren't wedded to the use of particular controls, but they're wedded to the availability of effective controls. So whilst biocontrols are, widely used, we mustn't shy away from the fact that the majority of food we eat and the plants we buy are still produced using conventional pesticides. So I started my plant health career in research. I did a master's in crop protection at a research station, which doesn't exist anymore, just outside Bristol, called Long Ashton. And that master's gave me my first kind of real taste of research. And I was lucky enough to get a project working in what then I think was called the Biological and Ecological Chemistry Department at Rothamsted. And that was led by John Pickett. And I spent a few months there working on semiochemicals to control pests of oilseed rape. So much of my following career, I think, really kind of started and developed from that 3 or 4 months stint I spent at Rothamsted, and particularly the people I got to know there and the relationships I started to build. So having got a taste for ecological and entomological research, I decided to do a PhD, and no doubt because of the experience and contacts that I'd gotten at Rothamsted, I was fortunate enough to get a PhD working on biocontrol of aphid pests of plum, based mainly at East Malling Research down in Kent, but I also had a supervisor at Silwood Park, which is part of Imperial College. And the real advantage of that PhD was that, it was funded by growers themselves through a levy, which was then being paid to the Horticultural Development Council. So this meant that I was working on real pest problems for real growers, and hopefully could try and make a difference. And it also meant I got to take my research onto real farms. And basically the research problem there was that plum growers face a challenge of 3 different aphid pests, and the one that causes the most physical damage to trees is a leaf curling aphid that develops in the crop really early in the season. So I set out to see what biocontrol opportunities existed in plum orchards. I did a huge amount of weekly surveying of both the pests, insects, and all the beneficials in orchards, and I did exclusion work to determine the impact of those beneficial communities. Also, because we had a sex pheromone available for one of those aphids, I played around with developing a trap that would lure in male aphids that would then pick up a dose of entomopathogen and leave the trap and disseminate that as they went around and found mates, basically, like some kind of aphid STD. And then basically what I found during my PhD was that this leaf curling aphid, it developed too early for it to be controlled reliably and effectively by natural enemies. But those natural enemies were in the orchards in good numbers and at the right time to tackle those aphid pests that occurred later. And so because growers had no way of controlling that early aphid without pesticides that impacted on insect communities, I worked on making available a selective insecticide that was then seen as being fairly low impact on beneficials. And my research showed that by using that, you basically controlled that early aphid pest and then kept your beneficial communities intact. So they then kept on top of the later occurring aphid species. And I managed to persuade the pesticide regulator in the UK to extend the approval of this selective insecticide and made that available to plum growers. As my PhD drew to a close, I decided that research was for me. I wanted to do more of the same. So again, because of the people I'd met, the contacts I'd made, the experience I gained, I was fortunate enough to get offered a post at Wellesbourne, a postdoc, what used to be the National Vegetable Research Station. It's now part of Warwick University. And I started working on, instead of orchards, it's working on field crops, carrots, brassicas, narcissus, linseed, other crops, and working with some world-leading researchers in those areas, including people like Rosemary Collier, who's still at Wellesbourne. And one of the fun bits of that postdoc, and really it started my PhD, was getting the opportunity to travel across Europe to meet other researchers, to attend conferences, like this one, and getting involved in groups, international groups like the International Organisation for Biological Control and their various working groups. One of the less fun parts was that it was a time when government was phasing out its funding of near market research, and I saw it as a constant battle really and a stress for my senior colleagues to try and secure funding. And so as my postdoc came to an end, I decided that perhaps I should look at getting a job that offered some greater security. So I left the world of plant health, but not agriculture, and I became a government agri-environment scheme advisor, where I was responsible for providing the technical advice on agri-environment schemes, including creating, conserving, restoring habitats and landscapes. So I was out on farm all the time, setting up new schemes, monitoring the progress of existing schemes, and it gave me a really good insight into understanding the level of management of these resources on farm. It's not just a case of, for example, scraping up the soil and throwing down some wildflower seed, to get that desired result, to get those habitats that deliver benefits for wildlife, those features, they need to be managed, much in the same way as a crop does, with quite high levels of management and input. And of course, that has costs associated with it. After nearly 5 years as an agri-environment scheme advisor, I decided it's time for a change. And nearly 18 years ago, I went for a job with the National Farmers Union, and I'm still there today. In terms of job roles within the NFU, I was a policy advisor in our horticulture and potatoes team for nearly 12 years, and I headed up that team for the last couple of those years. Then in 2017, I moved to join a newly created NFU Plant Health unit as a senior regulatory affairs advisor, and I also headed up our science and regulatory affairs team for a short while. My work on a day-to-day basis, it really focuses on plant health regulation in general, and particularly at the border, and it focuses on the regulation and its impact on the availability and use of crop protection products, pesticides, and relationships with UK regulatory authorities, and also still with EU institutions and international regimes. I've led the development of the NFU's plant health strategy, and that's a framework that all of our plant health and pesticide work sits under, and it has 5 main strands to it. They are the availability of effective controls for crop pests, weeds and diseases. The second one's IPM, integrated pest management. The third one's agronomic advice. The fourth one's transparency. And the fifth one is about having the right government policies and regulations in place to basically enable all of the above. I've also led on some of our more strategic work around Brexit and what the implications of that are for pesticides and what we as an industry are looking for from a future GB pesticides regulation. I've done a lot of work on integrated pest management, and I'm leading the NFU's work on how future sustainable farming incentive schemes could support the uptake of IPM in future, and that includes research again, and I'm leading test and trials project that's providing evidence that feed into that. And also, as it's been said, for the past 12 years or so, I've led on all of the NFU's work on bee health and insect pollinators and all the pesticide work associated with that. So at the weekend, if any of you read The Guardian, George Monbiot wrote an article complaining about how much say farmers have in the management of the countryside, given that they're only a very small part of the population. And he attributed a lot of that to the doing of what he called one of the most pernicious lobby groups in the UK, the National Farmers Union, and not letting the facts get in the way of a good story. He went on to give as an example, and I quote, if you want first to resist and then undermine a ban on the most deadly biocides invented, neonicotinoids, the NFU is there for you. And as part of that quote, he directly linked to me and my work. So clearly my work involves a good share of controversy. I spend a lot of time working on pesticides. It's hugely controversial. It's an issue that lots of organisations campaign against, one that the media loves to demonise and misrepresent, and one that's a political hot potato. And if you ask me how do I do that, what's the approach that I take, my answer is basically by taking a science and evidence-based approach. We're a member-led organisation, and all the work we do is directed by our farmers and our members. And what I do as an advisor is simply present the options that are based on the best available science and evidence. And sometimes this approach makes us look dogmatic, but what it also means as an organisation is we don't flip-flop around, depending on which way the wind is blowing. And my work on pollinators, it's really brought me full circle, and I'm really grateful to the NFU that it's provided me with the opportunity to develop my expertise in a very specific topic. And it now means I get to do really exciting stuff. It's like I represent not just all UK farmers on bee health issues, but I also wear a European hat. So I get involved in debates and discussions and policy and regulatory discussions where I'm representing all European farmers on bee health. And it's also given me the opportunity to get involved in research again, and involved with world leading research community. And I'm involved in EU funded projects on pollinators. In fact, I'm now a co-author on more published papers than ever happened when I was doing research full time myself. So to wrap up, I'd say there's a couple of really key common threads that span my career. The first is the importance of the science and evidence and using that as the basis for everything you do. And then the second is the relationships that you develop with the people that you work with and that you share interests with. And it's understanding other people's positions and points of view, and working together on those goals that you share in common. Thank you.
Excellent, Chris. Thank you. That's really comprehensive. I do have a soft spot for long Ashton nutrient solution, and I did work on neonics and aphids in a previous life, so we can maybe talk about that offline sometime.
Yep.
Okay, so thank you. So please put some questions, some themes emerging from both speakers, and I'm sure we'll pick up and diversify those with Bill's contribution. So please inform the discussion with some questions in Q&A. Remember, there's no such thing as a silly question. So over to you, Bill, from AHDB, and interestingly, I believe you started as a zoologist. So well, here you are in a plant health meeting.
So well, basically, after having heard all those lovely presentations from these early career researchers, I can definitely say I'm a late career person now. I should fess up and say I'm now 64, going on 65 this year. So I'm definitely coming towards the end of my career, but that hopefully makes me, if not older, then possibly wiser, but you can be the judge of that. So I want to start off just by giving you a very brief overview of what I think is the state of play in UK crop protection. You'll see some of the themes which other speakers have already mentioned come up, including Dick Shaw this morning, and we haven't collaborated, so it just shows we're all on the same page to some extent. So I think the first thing to say is that the risk posed to plant health by climate change is obviously a major one, and there's a really high risk of new invasive species or even new pests emerging from the indigenous pest disease and weed population. Let's not overlook that one. As Chris mentioned, pesticides regulation, and remember that pesticides regulation covers not just what you might call conventional plant protection products, but also biopesticides and semiochemicals like pheromones. And the real question for us, really, having exited the European Union, is how far the pesticide regulatory framework in the UK will diverge from Europe. And that's quite important because in world terms, the UK is not a big market for the agrochemical industry. And if the regulations here become tougher, then they simply won't register products here. And that will make the life of farmers and growers much more difficult because they won't have access to enough products to give them an effective crop protection toolbox. So one of the big questions at the moment really is, are there options for managing all the pest, weeds and diseases on the whole range of crops which are grown in the UK, and particularly in horticulture, which already have a rather limited toolbox? And a sort of key sub-theme of that is, can resistance issues, in which we have some quite serious ones, both in insects and diseases, can they be managed with available chemistry? And in some cases, the answer to that is no. Of course, the sort of flip side of that, and again, this was mentioned this morning, is there's a lot of interest in the development of biologicals as alternatives to conventional chemistry. There are a few sort of caveats with that. Biologicals do tend to be rather specific rather than broad spectrum, and by and large, they're less effective and require a much higher degree of knowledge to be used efficiently. So there is it's not a like-for-like swap by any means. And for horticulture, don't forget that if you want spotless vegetables in your supermarket, there's an issue of maintaining quality rather than just yield, which does in fact demand potentially high use of crop protection that might otherwise be the case. And finally, government policy obviously influences what goes on. And as Chris has already alluded to, the current government is very interested in promoting integrated pest management, or IPM, via the Sustainable Farming Incentive. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about IPM, not least of which is that it's not something you can tick a box and say, yes, I'm doing that. It's not a thing. It's basically a spectrum of activity, which will vary according to your particular situation as a farmer and grower. So for many farmers and growers, the idea of implementing IPM as it's described in the textbooks is actually very challenging. And actually at the moment, there's probably insufficient research funding in crop protection, and particularly for applied work. And as an applied scientist, I have to echo Chris's comment about the fight for funding that's gone on over the last 30 years that I've been involved. And it's basically been downhill all the way, I'm afraid. So just to put that, bring that to life, here's some very specific examples. These are things which have arrived relatively recently. So spotted wing Drosophila on soft fruit. We knew this one was coming. It finally arrived in 2012. We did a lot of work preparing for it. It is probably now the major pest on soft fruit and to some extent on stone fruit, particularly cherries as well. And it is currently at least reliant on emergency approvals for particular insecticides which tend to disrupt the IPM programs which are also used on these crops. Another interesting example is this Fusarium strain 4, Fol 4 on lettuce, which arrived completely out of the blue in 2017. Nobody saw this one coming, and it caused severe problems, particularly up in the northwest, but also elsewhere in the country for protected crops growers. There's no chemical control for this. The emergency authorizations which were requested were refused. So this is still a problem, and it still hasn't really got an answer to it particularly. More recently still, and this just shows that things do keep arriving, is tomato brown regrows fruit virus on tomatoes. This is something which again we knew was coming and which was spreading across Europe. And we have had some cases in the UK, first one in 2019. Again, you can't control this by conventional plant protection products anyway. We're very reliant on maintaining seed health and crop hygiene, but a major concern to the tomato industry in the UK. Another very recent arrival, you'll be aware of all the Phytophthora that have been affecting trees over the years, and this is another one, Phytophthora pluvialis, first record in 2021. And of course, we know there are things which are probably coming. I've just highlighted two here, the brown marmorated stink bug, Haliomorpha halis, and Xylella fastidiosa, which many of you will have heard of, which is a bacterial disease. So it just shows that we're never in a static situation here. There are always new things arriving, let alone the things that are already here that we have to deal with. But I think not to be too dismal. I think there are opportunities. Challenge brings innovation, and the industry, and particularly the horticulture industry, actually is very innovative and resilient and adaptable when it needs to be. The big companies are working on novel products and novel solutions, very much in the biological space. And so, some quite unconventional products are probably on the way. I think just to echo a comment that was made earlier, will they actually be seen as biological by consumers? I think the question was, should you be calling a biopesticide not a pesticide? I think that was a question which Dick Shaw had to address. And again, just to echo one of the things that Dick Shaw said, the whole issue of precision technology and robotics and data in many forms is absolutely going to revolutionize the industry, and already is in many ways. But underpinning it all, this sort of wider understanding and implementation of IPM is going to be essential, particularly given the pressure on available products and the way that government policy is going. And there is an opportunity for people like all these young career researchers to get involved here, because we need that greater level of awareness and knowledge of more diverse crop protection techniques and solutions. Government will push IPM down the IPM road. But one of the things that's not very clear, and this is one of the things that Chris has been working on, is how that will be done and indeed how that will be measured. And really that isn't absolutely clear at the moment. And finally, but by no means least, I think genetics has a key role here. And in my opinion, robust pest and disease resistance traits are the absolute bedrock of IPM. If we don't have that, then we're really struggling. And that, of course, raises the whole issue of GM crops, and particularly gene editing, and the whole issues around that, some of which are quite ethical, do need to be resolved. So how did I get into the position to be making that sort of short summary of where we are in crop protection? Well, this is probably what might look like a relatively simple career progression. It didn't feel like that. It's been characterized by constant change and often quite a lot of uncertainty. But I started off at Bang University doing a degree in applied zoology, and that's basically medical and veterinary parasitology and applied entomology. I graduated in 1979 with a first in that, and I was one of the only two people to have got a first in that degree up until that point. And that really gave me a gateway into doing a PhD also at Bangor on insect migration. And as it happens, the particular beastie was the African armyworm, Moths Spodoptera exempta, which in many ways is or still is the forerunner of the fall armyworm problems, which Dick Shaw mentioned this morning, and which is still very much an issue in parts of Africa. If you'd asked me at the end of my PhD what I wanted to do, I'd have probably said I wanted to go and work overseas. But at that time, it was virtually impossible to get a job in those sorts of areas. So I ended up as an advisory entomologist with ADAS. And if you don't know what ADAS is, at that time, it was the government, it was part of the Ministry of Agriculture at that point, the government extension and advisory service, which basically did a lot of very applied research and gave very specific advice to farmers and growers on just about everything you could imagine in agriculture and horticulture. So very fortunate to get that role. Fortunately or unfortunately, ADAS started to change virtually the day I arrived. And so I then progressed through a series of jobs as the organization changes, ending up as the team leader for horticulture research and consultancy, having done a spell as crop protection research team leader as well. And in 2009, I had the opportunity to apply for the job of Director of Horticulture for the then relatively newly created Agriculture and Horticulture Development Board, or AHDB, which is the people I still work for now. So that was basically taking on the management of what used to be the Horticultural Development Council, or Horticultural Development Company, which funded a lot of applied research in horticulture. In fact, it was the only major fund of applied research in horticulture. And of course, that's now stopped as the industry voted to cease the levy a couple of years ago. Did that for 6 years and then became, through various changes in the organization, became Director of Research for the whole organization. So that covered all the crops, so cereals and oilseeds as well, and all the livestock work, so dairy, pork, beef and lamb and so on. So everything. I suddenly had to become a sort of jack of all trades, really, as far as research is concerned. I deliberately stepped away from that job a couple of years ago, partly as a way of starting to sort of ease myself out, if you like, as I came towards the end of my career. So I'm now in this role at the moment called Head of Technical Programs, and I won't really attempt to explain to you what that is at the moment. Another way of looking at this actually is to say that I started off doing a fairly conventional technical and scientific training, then moved on to applying some of that knowledge in practice, but learning a whole lot more as well, including things like doing sales training, as well as various other things. Then you sort of progress into middle management, and then you start to get involved with human resources and budgets and that sort of thing. And then finally, the sort of more senior management positions, which tends to get very political with a small p, both internally and externally. And just in terms of money, when I started in ADAS in 1984, I wasn't in charge of any money. And by the time I ceased as Director of Research, I had a budget of £18 million to look after. So quite a sort of change in responsibilities over that period. So just briefly, some of the other opportunities and experience I've had, again, echoing some of the others. So really, I had an unparalleled training in applied entomology in ADAS, which you just can't get anymore. Just an enormous range of experience. So I had this very wide experience of pest management in arable and horticultural crops. Became a recognized expert, particularly with potato pests and wireworms, are a particular love of mine. And there are very few people in the world actually who do research on wireworms. But fundamentally, you often find yourself doing things that are outside of your comfort zone. And I think it's interesting to know that you can actually go into those and survive. I think that's a really good lesson to learn. And again, picking up on some of the things which Dawn and Chris have said, I think this ability to build partnerships between applied science and academic research is one of the things I most enjoyed, and the ability to work with researchers in Europe and beyond. As it says here, some became friends. It's a really good thing to get involved with. In fact, that the chap in the bottom left picture there, Lorenzo Furlan, is probably the world wireworm expert, and he's now a friend of mine. And yeah, you get involved in lots of other stuff as well as you get known, and your judgment is sought after. So there's a whole range of things here, not exhaustive by any means, some of which are still current. Just to pick out the top one there, was for a while I was an independent member of what was then the Advisory Committee on Pesticides. It's now called the Expert Committee on Pesticides, which is the independent committee which advises the government on issues related to pesticides. And in those 6 years, I was on the ACP when the whole neonicotinoid issue came up. And as partly as a result of that, I ended up sat in front of a select committee in Parliament, which is in itself quite an experience, I can tell you. But as you can see, there are a whole range of other things, including being on various program review groups, not just in the UK, but internationally as well. and I'm still a member of the strategic advisory boards for the Global Food Security Programme and for the BBSRC Plant Bacterial Diseases Programme. So what have I learned? Well, very quickly, in general, there's no such thing as stability. You know, I've always say to people, you know, change is a constant in working life. You either have to roll with it or get out of the kitchen and do something else. And sometimes it's a difficult decision. And I've seen that happen to many people over the course of my career. There is always more to learn, but I think one of the key lessons for me is to learn to trust your judgment. I think as a more junior person in any organization, you tend to think that the senior managers must know what they're doing and why they're being so stupid sometimes. But actually, often those senior managers are having to make decisions on very limited information and really not necessarily any brighter than you are when it comes to making those judgments. But hopefully their experience has given them some judgment. So you must learn to trust your judgment, because as you move up organizations in terms of seniority, your judgment will become very important. I've also learned that managing money is relatively easy compared to managing people, and there's a whole lot behind that, but I haven't got time to go into. Also in plant health and crop protection, again, no such thing as stability. You know, new threats are coming along all the time, and it's going to continue to be like that. So it's going to be continually challenging, probably more so as climate change really takes hold. And right now, at the moment, I think the ag and the hort industries desperately need good applied science on how to make IPM work. And the funding to do that is largely not there at the moment. And that really makes my last point, which is follow the money. But you know, particularly as a contract researcher, which I was for some years, you must follow the money. You know, money drives everything. Unfortunately, with money comes power politics, but that's just a fact of life. I have learned that applied science is largely undervalued by academia and government, and I think they do that at their peril. And I've also learned that the grey boundary between politics with a big P and science is a very untidy one, and that was certainly something which being on the ACP taught me. And finally, you know, what career advice would I give my younger self? I think the first thing would be, you know, you're capable of much more than you think you are. You know, when I joined ADAS in 1984, when I arrived, I sat down at a desk with a phone, which could have rung at any time with somebody asking me any question, which was terrifying, I have to say. And I didn't have a computer on my desk at that time, but I had a load of books. But then as you go through life, you learn that you can do things. So I think the next lesson is, you know, if you want to progress, take the opportunities that arise, even if they're frightening, because hopefully they will make you stronger and wiser. And I think that's certainly been the case for me. And, you know, who knows where life will lead amongst all of that. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Bill. That was a comprehensive and very insightful presentation. Again, picking up some of the things from the other people as well. So I've got a couple of questions come in. I mean, the comment from me really is the three people who've spoken. If Chris and Dawn could put their cameras on, then the audience can see them. That's good. Because when we look back over a career, where you've only got one option, and you've done certain things, and it looks linear. And so those uncertainties, and actually what there is a series of zigzags. And there's a question there for Dawn, which the other two might like to comment on as well, saying, you know, your career looks very smooth, as they all do retrospectively. But what were the significant hurdles from your perspective, Dawn? And I think Bill's touched on that a little bit, but Chris might also want to comment as well. Was it about funding or the independent research? What for you, what were the hurdles, Dawn? And then maybe the other two would like to comment as well.
I think I've been very lucky, you know, and I think unfortunately luck does play a part in it, but I do think you help yourself have luck. So, I mean, I intended to do a PhD straight from my degree. I didn't, because I didn't get the one I wanted. So that was that was one of those sliding doors moments. I worked for a couple of years, and I think that did me the world of good. I think then when I did do a PhD, I was much more prepared for it. The step to moving from Bath to UWE was sideways. I'd never worked on bacteria before, but I, a little bit like Bill just said, followed the money. I followed the opportunity there. I made, you know, quite a big step for me to go that way. I was very lucky that Professor Alan Vivian took me on. And then the big thing really was the fact that I was prepared to share my results, collaborate with people. That allowed me to put my first big grant application in with Professor John Mansfield in Y College, because I'd been working and talking to him a lot. And I think that really helped me get that first funding. And from there, I'm not saying it's easy, because it's never easy, but once you've got a grant, if you make sure you publish from it, you've got a chance that you can keep things working. So for me, it really was that external collaboration and sharing of ideas, and also being prepared to change. I started working on pathogens of trees towards the end of my time at UE, which I had never done before, but it was an excellent opportunity and I followed that. So it is linear, and I have been lucky, but I also feel like I've helped my luck in a little bit, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, thanks, Dawn. I mean, as you said, mentioned sliding doors. I mean, there are presumably an infinite number of alternative realities in which you did different things because of those decisions. Chris, have you got a comment on that, those hurdles and the transitions?
I guess the biggest challenge for me was, taking the decision to leave research after I did my postdoc, because I simply didn't want to be in this position of having to constantly fight for your next bit of funding to be able to secure your own job. And that was a big choice, and a hard choice, because I love doing research. But I guess the lesson from that is, you can find other organizations and other job roles where you can develop yourself, you can develop your expertise, and the NFU's given me the opportunity to do that in the area of bee health and pollinators, to develop my expertise, with that basis that I had in research, to the point where, I don't like to use the word, but other people see me as an expert, and as a consequence of that, it's come full circle, and I get invited to join research projects, EU level work in that area. So I guess the lesson from that is, yeah, there are challenges, but you can look necessarily outside of that kind of core research area, because you may have opportunities within other organisations to develop those interests and that expertise.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Have you got anything to add to that, Bill?
No, not really. I think, just speaking personally, there certainly have been one or two moments in my career where I've thought, where is this going? And I think particularly when I left ADAS and joined AHDB, that was a bit of a sliding doors moment. I think probably like Chris, I left because I could see that the hustling for money, if you like, particularly in entomology, which is where my area of expertise was just going to get harder and harder and harder. And did I fancy doing that for the next 15 years of my career? Well, probably not. So I was poacher term gamekeeper, really. So I went from bidding for money to handing out, well, not handing out the money, but being responsible for the money, which is quite an eye-opener in itself. I can tell you, it's a very different perspective on things.
So actually that leads nicely into another question which has popped up, which is really probably for Bill and Chris, but Dawn might want to comment. So you both did PhDs and then moved into a different area. How useful was the experience of the PhD? And I wonder whether this is outside the knowledge base, or maybe it's not, in the later career. And what advice would you give somebody who wants to make that applied move and away from the PhD research pathway? Bill, you've got Chris.
Well, sorry, go Chris. Yeah.
The fun, probably when I was doing my PhD, you get told that it's part of it is an education and in how to research a topic in depth, to understand it, to review all the currently available knowledge, and it's about learning that process of research and analysis. It's not necessarily about your scientific output at the end of that's just the cherry on the cake. That's a bonus, and I think that's the greatest benefit that I've taken into the rest of my career. It's not taking statements, whether it's a policy or a regulation that comes from government, or statements or whatever, not taking that on face value. Actually, if there's something in there that rings alarm bells, then I've got the skills to be able to dig deeper, to analyse that, to actually look at what the research and the evidence says, and then put together actually your own kind of view on what the research and evidence says, and be able to kind of counter those kind of statements. So I think that's, you know, and doing a PhD and doing research gave me all of that. It's that kind of learning, that ability to analyse, and that kind of process. And as I say, that's really paid dividends in the rest of my work.
Right.
Yeah, I think I broadly agree with Chris on that. I mean, I think when I look back on my own PhD, you know, it had its difficulties, and you know, it was a very challenging thing to do. But I guess it did teach me a lot of things that you know, weren't necessarily the technical things. But I think, you know, that you tend to do a PhD in a very specific topic, so that the chances of actually being able to apply that directly in a new role is probably relatively limited. Though having said that, I think I did do a job in ADAS where I had to go and help people with alfalfa, caterpillar control on alfalfa in Saudi Arabia, which sounds bizarre, and it was. But you know, at least I knew what an armyworm looked like. But yeah, I think also, you know, doing a PhD, you know, particularly in some of the circles you tend to move in as a senior manager, does give you a bit more credibility. It's not essential, and I know some very good people who don't have that sort of level of qualification. But I think it probably just helps give you that confidence, if you like, when you're sat around a table with the great and the good, really, and thinking, whoa, you know, what am I doing here, sort of thing. So yeah, okay. Chris will know exactly how that feels, I'm sure. Yeah.
So Dawn, how would you answer that question from inside the pipe?
I think it's interesting, actually, because obviously a PhD gives you a lot of experience in how to do research, how to carry out research projects, how to write it. But what it actually doesn't really prepare you for is how to become a lecturer. To me, that was quite a shock. So one thing I did do, and I'd recommend people to do it, I did my required teacher training course while I was doing a postdoc. So then when I applied to become a lecturer, I'd already got that experience of doing some teaching, and I'd got that qualification under my belt, which meant the university didn't have to give me half a day to do it, which they quite liked as well. So I think obviously the PhD really helps with the research part of being a lecturer, associate professor, but it's also important to remember it's not actually training you to become a university lecturer.
Yeah, I think
we used to fund PhD studentships, and you know, I think what I always said to people was that, you know, 90% of people who do PhDs don't end up in academia. So I hear what you're saying, Dawn, but you know, if you want to do that, that's fine. But there's plenty of opportunities for people with those sorts of level of qualifications to do some very interesting jobs in industry. So don't overlook that.
And I think Bill's slides where he showed the internal workings within the job and the development through management and then to leadership roles actually also happens in academia. As you go through the research roles, it's less about you doing the research and more about you overseeing strategy. And actually one of the most worrying things about being an academic, to get money, is get money for other people who are starting to develop families and rely on you to do that, which is stressful in any job, of course. Okay, so I think a question that an item that came up from all of you was the need to collaborate and to collaborate early on. Now, speaking from a personal perspective as a PhD student and then a postdoc, I didn't really particularly want to collaborate. A, because I thought I knew what I was doing, and B, because I was perhaps a little bit shy and anxious about things. So for somebody, and I think Chris touched on this a little bit in terms of the confidence that you have to have. I mean, what advice would you give to early career people about having the confidence to actually, actually network with somebody, to go up to somebody and speak to them? What's in it for them? And particularly maybe if they've got some anxiety issues as well, which we're increasingly aware of. Anybody like to pick that up?
Well, I'll pick that up. I mean, Chris knows me well. I'm quite a quiet sort of person, so I'm not the sort of person to do that. But I think, often science gives you that sort of handle which you can use to approach somebody. And I really enjoyed the sort of opportunity to to get involved with people who did academic and quite detailed research on some of the things I was interested in. And I was interested in how I could use that knowledge to better understand some of the more difficult applied problems we are facing. And some of the best work I've done, I think, was, you know, along those sorts of lines where you're marrying up that sort of real life problem with some really deep, you know, academic research skills to try and really understand what's going on. So I think my advice would be don't be frightened. I mean, what's the worst that can happen? You know, somebody can say no, you know, but actually you might find yourself ending up doing something really interesting.
Yeah,
but
I would echo that.
Sorry.
You know, it doesn't. You know, you'd be forgiven for thinking that confidence comes naturally. It doesn't. You know, I'm not that person who would naturally walk into a room of strangers, even though you're all there for the same conference, the same reason. That I would naturally walk into that room and just walk up to people and start chatting. That's like absolutely not me. But you know, if you're kind of armed with, you know, some knowledge, you know, you've got your own work that you can talk about, you've got a pocket full of facts, then, you know, you've got the tools there you've got the content there to be able to go and talk with people. So as Bill says, you know, what's the worst that can happen? There's so much opportunity out there, and people will be interested in what you're doing. And they want to talk and they want to help. And it's, as I say, it's looking for those common, you know, those things that you share in common. You know, I'm in a lot of meetings with a lot of organisations that have completely, you know, polar opposite views to myself and the NFU on some issues. But actually, you know, there can often be common ground. And if you talk about, you try and find out what that common ground is, and you know, those can be some of the most rewarding successes. It's not necessarily lining up with the people that you know and that you share common interests, you know you share interests with, but those people that you think are kind of polar opposite. But if you can find common ground with those people, that can be really rewarding.
Dawn, you were going to come in. Thanks, Chris.
You're saying it's good to take. You know, there are opportunities. For example, BSPP in their conferences, they run early career chats where they let people get together, and you know that they facilitate people getting together and talking, and in ECR sessions, and it's not always just about meeting that big person in your field who's very advanced, has got all the knowledge. There's people I met way back at the same level of me, at the same time as me, that as careers have developed over the years, that I'm friends with and collaborate with, and you know, have been very helpful. And it's also our responsibilities as PIs and leaders of research groups to help the people who work for us to meet people and talk to them, not just throw them into a room and let them get on with it as well. I think we've got a responsibility to help them with the networking.
Yeah. Okay, good. I'm aware we're slightly over. There's one other question that's come up, which is really asking about somebody who's submitting her PhD in the plant area, and then wondering about location, where you should be located. And there's a broader question there. You know, she's saying, is there a map of plant science places that you could go to? We've already heard of Long Ashton's long gone and so on, but what about remote working and so on within the industry and potentially within academia? Anybody got any views on that?
Well, I think remote working is almost becoming the norm at the moment. I think clearly if you're doing research, it probably helps to have people around you, you know, who can help you and advise you and so on. And obviously, if you have field sites and if you're working outdoors, then, or even if you need a lab, you know, you need to have a sort of permanent site, if you like. But I think the ability to work remotely in all sorts of ways is the future, really.
Chris or Dawn, do you see some nodding there?
No, I agree with that, but obviously also the practical elements of things where you've got to be there to do it as well. So depends what you're doing.
I mean, certainly all I would add is that, yeah, there's nothing to kind of fear from remote working and you know, having meetings like this virtually, and you know, in this area of working on plant health and plant health at the border, you know, I've developed relationships with teams within government and it's been purely virtually, and developed really good working relationships with people. So that's not something to put people off, but it's still there is still of course a need to get together in real life with people as well.
When I was in ADAS, particularly managing the horticulture team, I managed a team of 25, 30 people. The nearest one was 100 miles away, so all over the country. So it's you have to learn how to deal with that sort of thing, really.
Okay, thanks. I mean, that's been really insightful, both the presentations and your very reflective answers on the questions that we've been getting. I think one thing that I've taken from this, and looking back on my career, which is similarly linear perhaps to Dawn's in a sense, it is the advice I think that Chris put forward, that I wish I'd had the confidence to act on myself in my own career, which was, your opinion matters, even if it's not as informed as you start out on your career. And when people send a report and ask you to comment on it now, I have to go, okay, I've got some experience, and therefore, even if I'm not that sure, my opinion is of value. And I think that's true at any stage of your career, and you have to have the confidence to do that.